Welcome to ICOR's December webinar. We don't always do a webinar in December, so we thank you all for joining us as we begin actually the ending of our second year of webinars. Topic of today's webinar is reputation management. We're going to be talking about reputation as well as risk to reputation and how you can improve your reputation and those sorts of topics. I am presenting. This is Linda Nelson, the ICOR president, and I am the author of CMC 5000, the Crisis Management and Communication Professional Course and Certification. We are excited to announce that this class is now available as an instructor-led course. I think the first course is in February. Today's objectives include understanding the importance of an organization's reputation, methods organizations can use to strengthen its reputation and brand identity, being able to understand the importance of monitoring social media, describing how to protect your organization's reputation, and then also listing how to recover from an impact to your organization's reputation. I wanted to remind you of the questions button. So if you have a question as we go through today's webinar, please post it in the questions button, if a question, comment, anything like that. And I will take a look at the questions at the end of the webinar. I am on my own today. We actually had two webinars scheduled at the same time for our office, the same as we had last month. At least they were consecutive, but this month they're at the same time. We're doing a webinar for another organization. So I'm on my own, but I will answer your questions at the end. So let's just start with the really basic question. True or false? There's no such thing as bad publicity. And I always, when I was growing up, I was a fan of Charlie Brown, you know, and here he goes and he hits Lucy in the head, or whoever this is. I know I should say a fan, but remembering everybody's names isn't my best spot. You know, and Charlie says, "You hit her even though you knew you were going to get in trouble. You know, she'd tell on you." And he's like, "Well, sure, I want people to know how good I am." Is there no such thing as bad publicity? Normally we do polls, and we are going to have polls today, but I wanted to just take a quick look at this. And there's a place next to your name where you can raise your hand. So click on the raise your hand button if you think there's no such thing as bad publicity, if you agree with this, if you think it's true. Just wanted a quick idea of what you guys think. So let's just to see if everybody understands how to raise their hand, click the hand button if you think it's false. If you do think there's a problem, you know, that bad publicity can hurt you. Well, we know it can hurt you, but that if it, you know. So it looks like about half of you are actively voting, and we have a lot more hands raised for this one. And it really is something that you should think about. I think times have changed since the Charlie Brown days and since the days where everybody got their news from a physical newspaper as well. So that's something to consider as we go through today's webinar. We also need to remember that reputations change. They're living, breathing, evolving things. And just like other risks, risk to reputation can have an immediate impact on your organization and how people think about your company. And it's kind of sad, but this the sign here in the middle, "I don't like your company." People can say whatever they want, and everybody, you know, not everybody can read everything, but it becomes public. And this social media advent has really changed how organizations are at risk from reputational impacts. So your personal brand is often thought of as being equal to your reputation. And this was for sure, you know, whether it's your person or a company, but it's essentially the public's perception of you and your business. You know, what are you known for? What do people think about you? When you look at the brand of a company and the different products that it has and how that impacts its reputation. So reputation management is really deciding the value that you want to be associated with And then you need to intentionally promote and curate that image. So this is where you're looking at, you want to be seen as a trusted organization. You want to be seen as honest, one with integrity, or maybe you don't care about any of those things. So just like any other organization, or just like in sports, I should say, the best defense is a good offense. So you need to consistently work on building a personal brand that is so strong that you can survive a negative onslaught. And those of you that are in the business continuity or risk, area, or even the crisis management area, understand you try to strengthen your organization. So if something bad happens to you, you can withstand that. And that same premise is for reputational risk as well. And just as you're talking about your personal brand, remember now that even if you're applying for a job, companies are looking at your social media. Who are you? What is your own personal brand? And also for those of you that maybe, you're the person who is seen as a leader of your company, that person's brand is also going to be very much influencing the company's brand. And so you need to think about, how can your company or your organization withstand bad publicity? And if you're a small business owner, you as a business owner are going to be reflecting your organization. And so you need to make sure that your own personal reputation reflects the values of the organization itself. And I want you to think about this comment that I'm going to make next as we go through some of the different case studies for organizations that have had some challenges, is that both people and companies that are well-liked can withstand bad publicity better than those who aren't well-liked. And this is very much a soft issue, and it's something that it's difficult to measure, but we see it over and over again that certain people are forgiven and certain companies are forgiven for different reasons, and others aren't. So understanding why that is so. I want to take a look next at brand versus reputation. We said that brand equals reputation, but there are some soft differences between those. One is that brand is deliberate. It's usually associated with an organization or a company or an enterprise, and it can be changed at the will of its owner. I will argue, though, with that second bullet, that I think that's changing with social media, that we now have people with personal brands, and what they post about themselves publicly is becoming part of that image and brand. Reputation exists with or without the owner's consent. Reputation attaches to individuals or enterprises as well. And reputation cannot be changed as easily. And in this aspect, meaning you can change your brand a little bit easier than you can change your reputation, except maybe in the negative manner. So let's start our first poll. Somebody asked last month, in our evaluation, why do you do polls? Well, doing these polls helps us to understand who you are and who's actually attending today. And it helps me as a leader of this presentation to understand how to maybe address and give different examples for some of the things that we're doing. So go ahead and set, what is your role? Are you more in the crisis management communication role, the risk management role? And I should have actually given you the opportunity here to choose more than one. So just pick your top role, I guess. And if you pick other, if you don't mind, in the questions pane, just putting what other you might represent. Give you a couple more seconds. We have a little over half of you have voted. All right. It's very interesting today. We have a large group here of business continuity people, and then the second largest is on risk management. We don't have anybody from legal and public relations, which I find really interesting because risk and reputational things often fall to the legal and public relations department. So they may feel that they have this all in hand as it is. So let's go ahead and dive into the webinar. What is reputational risk exactly? And I found it interesting that the best definition I got was from the U.S. Federal Reserve, and they defined it as the potential that negative publicity regarding an institution's business practices, whether true or not, will cause a decline in the customer base, costly litigation, or revenue reductions. And then they also say that while a positive reputation can be a valuable intangible asset, reputational harm can lead to a loss of trust with key stakeholders and also significantly hurt your bottom line, which I think we all understand. So the next part of this webinar, I always like to share kind of what's in the news. And when I was looking for reputational risk types of things in the news, there was a lot to choose from. So what I tried to do was to come up with different examples by different industries, knowing that you're not all working for the same industry and that you might find some of these examples more helpful than others. This is one that I had not considered, and when I looked at universities, I found actually 4 or 5 big reputational risk things that happened to universities just in 2018. This is a case where a school in Maryland had a football player who died from heat stroke. And one of the things that was, besides just being sad, was that when the report came out, it showed that if he had gotten proper care, that he might not have died. And so that's really the twofold aspect of this is, number one, that they weren't paying attention to their players as far as the heat in Maryland when they were practicing, and secondly, that they didn't provide the best care that they could have. The other thing that became a bigger challenge for them, besides just the sadness of losing a player, was that they had just launched their fundraising campaign where they were trying to raise $1.5 billion. And so, you know, fundraising for universities tends to be confidential. Those interactions with people tasked with asking for large sums of money and those proffering it is largely the result of relationships built and privacy. And it's usually tied to former students, of course, or parents of students. But it's really tied to this relationship and this commitment. And so this became a real challenge when the school was coming under scrutiny for how they react, number one, for allowing it and how they reacted to it. So then at universities, you have board members, and board members are most often volunteers, and they get elected to board positions, but you don't necessarily have as much control over what they say and do as you might in a corporation. And in this case, the Board of Regents forced the university's president to reinstate the head coach who'd been put on leave as a result while the investigation was going on. And this didn't really sit so well. So remember, with a university, you have 2 types of donors. You have donors who are donating because of their affiliation and interest in the sports programs, which are huge donors, as well as the academic donors. And it is kind of sad to say that sports programs actually bring in more money than support for the academics, but that is a fact. And so once that happened, then the chairman of the foundation became upset and had some public comments. And so between those 2 things, essentially what the message was to the donors as well as to the students and alumni was that the university was placing athletes over student safety. And so one member of the foundation who'd been given the university millions of dollars said she was going to withhold future funding. And it became very public. And essentially, just to put it in a nutshell, that they did not come anywhere close to meeting their $1.5 billion fundraising. I'm sure you've all seen Facebook in the news. Facebook has been in the news for years and years and years. But 2018 was a difficult year for them. They came into 2018 with a damaged reputation, and there was concern about abuse, hate speech, as well as privacy, and all of those things have snowballed over this year. What they have found was that they lost a lot of shares. You know, they had gone public a few years back, And it really led to a whole new level or new round of protests against their stock that sparked a, delete Facebook campaign even at one point. And what is usually the pattern with Facebook is that they really struggle to respond to negative publicity, and they usually underestimate the level of anger that the public has. And I think part of that is that, this is Linda's opinion, is that Mark Zuckerberg isn't necessarily very likable. And as the face of Facebook, not having a very likable person as your leader doesn't help either. In one of ICOR's courses, we actually have I think it's the crisis communication professional, actually, crisis management communication professional. We actually have Mark Zuckerberg's fake apology. He's apologizing all the time. All the time he's apologizing, and they never seem very sincere. And it could be that he's just a techie person, but who's ever the face of your organization needs to know how to apologize, and they need to know how to speak to their users as well as the people who are their investors and their what we call stakeholders and shareholders. During the past year, they lost the WhatsApp. They also lost their tie-in with Instagram. And in the New York Times report that just came out in November, one of the things that they exposed was that while Facebook was trying to defend themselves, they used some underhanded tactics, and they were been accused of lacking a moral compass. And this idea of morality and moral compass is going to be a reoccurring issue as we talk today about risks and reputational management. So one of the things that's happened is that employee morale has fallen, and Glassdoor, who does a lot of analysis on different companies, says that they've actually seeing some challenges in their ability to create or to recruit new hires. And they did lose their title as, Glassdoor's best place to work. And maybe that doesn't matter, if you're not number one. Is number 2 or number 10 okay? Because I don't see people flocking away from Facebook. Maybe the younger generation isn't using it in the same way that the older generation uses it, but it's still growing, and they still have investors. So I want you to also consider, as we're talking here today, I mentioned that, some organizations are going to be able, and some people are going to be able to get away with more than others. And in this aspect, even though people might hate Facebook as an organization, they still like Facebook and the tools that it provides, and the users are still using it. An example of the finance one, I hope you weren't one of the people whose data was breached. I actually, out of my family of 6, 3 of us were on that list of people whose personal information was shared, which is disturbing. This all happened in September of 2017. And this really turned into a public relations catastrophe for them, and it caused major damage to Equifax's brand and their reputation. Their buzz score, which is an indication of how negative or positive people feel about a brand, fell 33 points in the first 10 days after the hack was publicized. They also lost $4 billion in stock market value. And then they had an additional amount of penalties of $439 million. To me, those numbers just seem astronomical. But those were the facts. And the fact also is that Equifax isn't an exception. I want you to start considering how cyber attacks and cybercrime can impact the reputation of your organization if you are breached. And this is really primarily for the financial institutions, but it isn't just about their financial institutions. We're seeing that there's more cyber attacks, as we presented in one of our previous webinars, in hotels, restaurants, but I think hotels was the number one. So where the financial institutions have to report it, hotels don't necessarily have that same compliance issues, and they don't have the same penalties that they might face. So they might be less likely to report it. And one of the cyber researchers has said that by 2021, they think that the annual cost of cybercrime is going to be more than $6 trillion. and that, this is not going to go away. So you need to be considering how your organization might be impacted, and your reputation of your organization might be impacted by cybercrime. And just remembering the compliance with new regulations, GDPR, as well as other regulations that we might have in the U.S. You may have seen this over the summer. Papa John, he was the person who created Papa John's Pizza. And this is something that I consider really interesting, not just, I guess, more concerning than interesting, is that he was in a media training session trying to learn how to speak appropriately when his company was attacked over racial slurs or racial problems. And because in his training session he used what was called inappropriate and hurtful language, that got published. And it was really strange to me that something in a training session would become public knowledge. He did apologize, but within 9 hours after Forbes published this study or published this article, he made his public statement. But by later that day, it didn't really matter. He did his apology. He was asked to step down as the public person and the leader of his own company. Those of you in Europe have probably heard about the scandal of, I think it's called Carillion. This is actually a government contractor. They do work all over the world, and they went out of business in 2018, and it was because they hadn't done a very good job with their investing and their work, and they had a lot of people employed around the world, especially in South Africa and Europe and the UK. And because they're a government contractor, it costs taxpayers money in these countries as well. And one of the problems was, as it came out in a report out of the UK, was that they had accounting firms that were working for them, the quote big top four, and there was nothing in their reports that showed that they were vulnerable to a collapse, that they didn't have the money coming in to sustain their organization. This was big news. BBC reported on it for quite some time. But as a result of this, the auditors, and specifically KPMG, has been under a lot of heat because of their affiliation with Carillion, and because they were the auditors of one of the larger auditors of record in the South Africa part of the organization. And this has caused a lot of negative publicity for KPMG. One of the things that came out of it is that, number one, it's PwC, KPMG, Deloitte, and Ernst & Young. And one of the reports that came out said that they earned over 71 million euros as part of the work that they did for Carillion. They also, this is since 2008, and one of the reports that came out said that the sorry saga is further evidence that the big four accountancy firms are prioritizing their own profits ahead of good governance at the companies they are supposed to be putting under a microscope. The Bank of England is also audited by KPMG, and so this is impacting their business all around the world, and they're really seeking assurance that whether KPMG's existing clients are planning on cutting ties with the firm, or whether it's struggling to win new business in lieu of that heavy criticism for their work in South Africa. One of the challenges is that they have had to cut a lot of employees. Essentially, the article talked about hemorrhaging clients and cutting hundreds of staff in South Africa. And just remember, back in 2002, we had the Enron and Arthur Andersen. At that time, it was the Big Five. And with that big scandal came the Big Four. So KPMG has come out with a statement that they have repeated, saying that KPMG is in robust financial health. They're seeing outstanding growth right across our audit, tax, and advisory arms. We have a strong balance sheet, and we are well funded with a growing pipeline. This is really important information, because once you're perceived as not having money, people won't hire you. It seems like kind of a circular thing. They also said that the Bank of England has a legitimate duty to scrutinize the market, but they have not approached KPMG formally or informally. If they were to, we would be happy to reassure them of our robust financial health. And they responded with that the PRA is not in discussions about the viability of any of the audit firms. They also, KPMG has appealed to the government of South Africa, and they have issued several apologies. And in an open letter that they published in the South African newspapers, KPMG South Africa's spokesperson said that the local unit of the audit giant was very different from 18 months ago, after a period of significant introspection and change. And he said, "I'd like to make an appeal to South Africa business, government, and the public," he wrote, "asking for recognition of its efforts, patience, and the chance to play a positive role in South Africa. KPMG has nothing to hide," the letter also said, adding the firm cooperated with inquiries and would accept responsibilities for its misdeeds. They also apologized repeatedly for their role in some of South Africa's largest, in their largest corruption scandal. And they really have gone out of their way, obviously, to apologize to individuals, using the newspaper and using many, many different avenues. This next one is a fashion one, and I guess I could say how unfashion-minded I might be because I had to look up how to say it. And like all things in Google, there was actually a YouTube video on how to say their name. So Dolce & Gabbana. They were in the news because they were China is one of their largest markets. And the reason I picked this one is because you need to understand a country's culture if you're going to do business with that country. China is a crucial market for them with 44 boutiques. And globally, Chinese customers are responsible for 1/3 of all luxury spending. And what happened with them, and if you hadn't heard the news, they faced a boycott after Chinese expressed outrage over what was seen as a culturally insensitive set of videos promoting a major runway show in Shanghai. And then there was a subsequent post of insulting comments in a private Instagram chat as well. The company did blame hackers for the anti-Chinese insults, but they evidently didn't do an adequate job because the explanation fell flat. And the damage was already done. So these Milan designers had to actually cancel their Shanghai runway show, which was meant to be a tribute to China, as their guest list of Asian celebrities quickly joined the protesters. So here it had a huge impact on them. They think it's estimated that it may be impossible for them to work in China for several years, and that their brand may be so damaged that they may have to wait until what they're calling a lost memory, so that the current people that were impacted might not see it again. And we do know that people have short-term memories about what's in the media, but they ended up having to pull their merchandise from shelves, as well as some of their powerful e-commerce sites deleted their wares. And they, the co-founders went on camera. They apologized to the Chinese people in general. They also made an apology video. And it really shows the importance of the Chinese markets, as well as the risks in operating it. And I don't know, I'm not a business owner that's trying to sell to China, but when you have countries with a culture that may not be the same as the culture of this company, you really need to understand that culture when you're doing business with them. They also think that because they do so much business in China, that it could shake their financial health overall. And so there's actually speculation in the marketplace that they might not survive without this market. So one mistake can almost, may potentially bring this company down. I also wanted to look at athletes because I have found this really confusing as to why some people can do things and nobody cares, and other people, I'm talking individuals here, who can't. And this is an example of, Alex Rodriguez is a baseball player in the United States. He plays for the New York Yankees, and he was caught doping, and he had to sit out. I'm not exactly sure if it was a full season or more than a season, or I'm not a big New York Yankees fan, so I don't know that. But essentially, his reputation didn't really take a hit, where Lance Armstrong has been hugely penalized after, for what he did. And I don't know how many people follow bicycle racing versus how many people follow baseball to see if that has an impact or not. But it's just really interesting that there's a difference. And so I'm going to surmise is that Lance Armstrong also represented the American Cancer Society. And so the money or one of the cancer associations, and he was raising money for cancer as the spokesperson for this organization and he raised billions of dollars for cancer research. So not only did it cost him his career and all of his recognition and medals, he also had to pay fines. He's paid over $7 million in lawsuits. He had to spend more than $100 million fighting lawsuits. All of the people that, a lot of the companies that were donating to his organization sued him for the money that they lost in the donations. And all I can surmise is that it was his behavior. He denied for almost a decade until he went on Oprah and said, and said that he did use the doping, that because of all of his denials and his behavior afterwards, he just didn't treat people well. He also sued people who accused him of doping. It was really the behavior that impacted how people thought of him. And I also think it's its affiliation with the fact that people trusted him with a lot of money. He was asking for people to donate money, where Alex Rodriguez is just a baseball player. But because Lance Armstrong was asking for money, and that money was seen as something that was important to people, that impacted the lashback at him. And it has impacted, the name of the organization. It's now called Livestrong. And they are doing better now that he is no longer their spokesperson. But it's just kind of something you need to be thinking about is, how is your organization perceived in the marketplace? Will the backlash of your organization doing something wrong be stronger than maybe another organization? What is your risk to reputation, to a problem with your reputation? And looking at your top management, and if you have a face to your organization, just like we saw with the pizza company, he was the face of the organization, just like Lance Armstrong was the face of this organization with its fundraising. What kind of risk does that put you in for, and how vulnerable can you be for that? Because alternatively, I'm sure you've all seen the video of the doctor who was dragged off an overbooked United flight, and immediately, and United Airlines has done a ton of things that, I just heard about a puppy dying. I'm like, seriously? Put it in an overhead luggage compartment? Who would do that? So they have continuously been sued. There was also an incident with a guitar that was damaged because of them not doing something correctly. But they immediately lost $500 million in stock value. But long term, and actually within a month afterwards, they recouped that money, and they actually had more passengers flying 1 month later than they had the prior year. So why is that? And it's really surmised that travelers don't always have a lot of airlines to choose from. And, maybe they want to get the lower fare, and the convenient schedule is more important to them than the brand or the image or the reputation of who they're flying for. And nobody wants to give up their frequent flyer perks just to make a statement. So again, consider what your organization is, and how much your reputation might be damaged, because this is where protecting your reputation is going to cost money. So having an understanding of the value of reputation and how vulnerable you might be is going to be really important when you're looking at this. So let's take our second poll. I'm just curious to know, has your organization experienced a negative impact on its reputation? So give me a second to get that launched. So your choices are, pretty much yes or no, but the yes ones are qualified with, how often or how recent. And this also kind of goes to, I heard that you were a lot of business continuity people attending today. So remember that a lot of what you plan for in business continuity are things that haven't happened to you before, but that might. And so this argument of it that it hasn't happened before isn't going to be a selling point or reason not to protect your organization. So let me go ahead and share. It looks like just over 50% of you are not aware of any risk to your reputation or that anything bad has happened to you. 18% in the past year, 12% in the past 1 to 3 years, and 18% in the past 10 years. So when you're looking at 50% not sure and the other 50% yes, so I would pretty much say that you might be safe to say here that it's not a matter of if, but when. And we're looking at some of these risks to reputation with social media growing and growing and growing. I don't see how this is going to become a smaller thing. It's only going to become a bigger thing, and something that all organizations need to consider. So I spoke a little bit about, impacts to your reputation. And one of the things that came out in a lot of different research was that how your organization communicates impacts its reputation. So you need to go back and look at your organization as, how are your messages formed? Who owns the messaging in your organization? Who writes the messaging? And what kinds of things are considered when you do your messaging? How are your messages delivered? Are you delivering in the messages the same way that you're receiving messages? Who are your interested parties? Now looking at, how are your audiences reached? Who are your interested parties or your key stakeholders? Who do you need to be communicating with? And then how do you deliver that? And then lastly, do you look at how well your messages are received? One of the key things that we always talk about in our education programs is the fact that you can't just write your messages at the last minute. You've got to be thinking of potential things that could happen to your organization. So a lot of companies buy, your communications tools or notifications tools, and they have these tools in place, but they haven't actually written their draft messages. So start considering, one of the things we say is, what's the worst true thing someone can say about your organization? Because everybody has things that they're not proud of or they might be vulnerable to. So what's the worst true thing that someone else or someone could say about you? And start planning and writing those responses so that if that happens to you or something similar happens, you already have some draft responses, because you need to know that your legal team is going to want to approve everything that you've said. So make sure that you have these draft responses already approved so that you don't lose any time. You're not waiting a week to respond or even a day to respond, that you have something that you can put out there almost immediately. And secondly, how your organization or the leadership in your organization behaves impacts its reputation. This is what we saw kind of with the Lance Armstrong example, is that people care about how you behave. And when we're looking at, expectations being met or missed, sometimes your reputation might sell stocks, and sometimes it might not. Are you actually meeting your financial things? And so when you look at the KPMG thing, for example, they're talking about, yes, they messed up, but in their messaging, they were talking about the fact that they're still financially strong, that they've made changes so that it doesn't happen again. So this idea of who your organization associates with is also really important. And I think, while the Arthur Andersen and Enron example has been the one that people always provide, it might be the Carillion and the top 4 auditing companies in the future that have become the example. And also, what is the vision of your organization? This kind of goes to the expectations aspect as well. Your vision for the organization's vision and what it is they do is going to impact what people expect from you. So consider that as well. A hospital is going to be held at higher accountability than a restaurant, for example. So let's look at how you can strengthen your reputation. Number one, through good works. And we'll talk a little bit about social accountability. Also, you need to let people know about your good works. I'm always a failure at this, which is, you just expect people to know that you're doing good things. But in reality, you need to let people know that you're doing good things. And this becomes part of the marketing strategy for organizations. You also need to understand your audience. You need to understand the needs and expectation of those interested parties. You need to make good choices of association. You need to have clear visions that are well presented, and you need to make sure you're fulfilling your expectations of what you say that you're going to do. On the other side, if you do bad things, it's going to hurt your reputation. Same thing if you fail to meet the expectations. And remember, there can be active smears by opponents. I was talking to somebody the other day that runs a small, not physical therapy, but it's like a massage therapy company. And they've been just struggling because 3 years ago, one person who wasn't a real person posted something negative that none of it was true on on the internet, and that now comes up. So if you want to search for their organization and look for what people think about them, that comes up as the number one thing because that gets read. It's like their only negative comment, so that gets read, and therefore it then brings it to the top as a negative comment. So be aware of the fact that your opponents or your competitors might be actively smearing you as well. If you have a perceived lack of character, kind of like with the Facebook piece, you perform poorly under stress, again, poor choices with association, that you don't communicate very well, and that you might show indifference to what people think about you. And again, failure to deal appropriately with wrongdoers, meaning if there's someone at your organization that has messed up, not dealing appropriately with that. And we saw that with the university example as well, in not really understanding how to deal with what they did, and they didn't do a very good job with it, which also hurt them. And like I said before, attorneys are always going to advise silence. So make sure that you have plans for dealing with risk to reputation, and make sure that you're not ignoring social media. So why does your reputation matter to a crisis management professional or even a business continuity professional? Remember that in times of stress, a reputation is most vulnerable, that opponents or your competitors often choose a stressful time to attack and give themselves as a solution. Also, poor performance under stress is perceived as a flaw in character of the organization. And a crisis is usually perceived as a flaw as well. So making sure that you don't have a crisis, and if you do, how you react to it is important. And just remember that when you're there's so much in the news today about climate change and natural disasters and, those impacts to your organization as far as natural disasters. But remember that reputational risks are also very, very important. I talked a little bit about bad reviews. Harvard Business School did a study about how bad reviews affect reputation, and they found that for every 1-star increase in Yelp rating, there is a 5 to 9% increase in revenue, and that some hotels are now adjusting their prices based on their reputation on social media. And also a really scary finding is that 80% of people will not buy from businesses with negative reviews. And the other thing that I found that was really interesting is that, you know, for a company that they said that a restaurant that has 3 stars and a restaurant with 5 stars, that the income difference can be, or the revenue difference can be as much as 18%. So if a restaurant makes $1 million annually, that represents about $180,000 in lost sales every year if they're a 3-star versus a 5-star. And lastly, that for every negative review, you need 10 to 12 positive reviews. So if you go out and look at your organization and you look at the reviews and look and see how many negative reviews you have and how many positive reviews you have, you may need to get on a social media campaign to increase the number of positive reviews. Remembering that social media is the wild card of reputation. It is freedom of speech in its purest, rawest form. It's almost impossible to stop people from saying something that's even untrue. And then you need to have a plan for how are you going to deal with provocation. Do you ignore it or do you address it? This is a really interesting thing, and you need to be looking at people in the public relations department as well as your lawyers for an answer for this. Because sometimes ignoring it is the best answer. Not engaging can actually make it go away faster than if you engage that whoever's provoking you. So remember to consider your social media audiences and what they want and what they need, what their expectations are from you. If you're not monitoring social media, you know, good luck. This is something that you should be doing. There are tons of tools out there. This is just a snapshot of a blog that was talked about 10 free social media monitoring tools. But if you're an organization that values its revenue and its reputation, yes, free is good, but there's no reason why you can't be looking at some paid tools as well. Also consider your workplace conundrum. Access to social sites at work is viewed as the most important communication issue or problem or opportunity, and that access to social media in many organizations is blocked by the IT department or because of organizational policies. So you should find out what the policy is at your organization, because social media is a plus and a minus. Somebody needs to be monitoring it, and somebody needs to be determining what can be published and what can't, and what employees can do. So if we're looking next at how to protect your reputation, one of the biggest mistakes that businesses make is taking steps to protect their reputations only after a crisis occurs. So we saw that over 50% of you just about had already experienced a reputational crisis. So the internet's not going away. Social media is not going away. So managing reputational risk should be an ongoing initiative. And you need to carefully shape your messages that the public receives about your products and services, because you may lose significant control in public forums created by internet. Remembering that people can post negative comments about a business anonymously in real time. So there are some things that you can do. By setting this tone at the top, it needs to really be coming from your top executives and management staff. This is something that they own. And it's essential that most visible members of your organization represent the core values of your company and take active steps to avoid negative publicity. And this includes vetting not only the statements that top executives make to the media, but also what they professionally and personally post to social media. You need to make sure that you're integrating reputational risk into whatever risk assessment that you're doing. It cannot be ignored. It's no longer adequate to just be doing risks from natural disasters. So having an understanding of your reputational risk is very important for your key decision makers. It also helps you get a clear picture. You need to, just like you do with any other risk assessment, you need to get feedback from all your departments, making sure that you include specifically public relations, customer service, your HR, and your legal, and as well as your marketing team. These people are going to have important viewpoints that you need to consider. We've talked about monitoring your online platforms. Has to happen. Can't ignore it. And then focus on the positive. This is where we talked about strengthening your organization by making sure that you've got an online presence and using it to promote accurate and positive information about your company. This is your time when nothing bad is happening to your company to really put out and get your reputation and your branding as strong as possible. You also need to train your employees. You should have a social media policy. Make sure anyone who's authorized to speak on behalf of your company is trained to manage reputational risk, as well as to respond to potential threats. These are skills that are really important for anybody who's engaging with the public via social media as well. And these statements are usually made in real time, and often you can't edit them once they're published. So once people started reading them and sharing them, they're there. And lastly, of course, plan for the worst. When I said, talk about what's the worst true thing that anybody can say about you. This is where you need to plan for the worst. And there should be somebody designated to be responsible for this activity. There's a great website that I've been referencing several times, melissaagnes.com, and this is an example of a public relations firm whose identity is very much tied to one person. And she talks about controversies being amongst the most difficult types of negative events to manage effectively. And this is because they're emotionally charged situations that automatically segregate your audience. And this really helps to create a high risk for fast escalation for this. So the first thing she recommends is that you be thoughtful. Think through the situation in alignment with the organization's core values. Seek to understand all sides of the controversy and its emotional relatability. And then assess all potential risk on the organization's reputation and its connection with its stakeholders. Be decisive. Take a decisive stance in alignment with the organization's values. Know that you will not appeal to or please everyone as controversy segregates, which means that being decisive is really important. Don't make a decision you'll go back on, kind of like we saw at the university thing. There was a lot of wobbling there, and they actually got both sides angry. And make sure that your team understands that some stakeholders will most likely not be happy. You can't please everyone. You have to make a decision, and you need to be decisive. Also, be really clear. Make sure you release a strong statement that clearly and concisely explains your position, your decision, and your reasoning. Don't be ambiguous or leave room for misinterpretation or misconceptions. And then be quiet and monitor. We talked briefly about not engaging. Once you've done those three things, there's really nothing left to say. So let the conversation take place, continue to monitor, evaluate, how well received was what we said, and then establish some kind of threshold that if, things continue to escalate, that requires, notification and escalation, if you haven't already escalated it to leadership, to do so. And of course, implement a social media policy. You've got to have one. If you don't have a social media policy, get one. So let's take our last poll. We're going to talk lastly about, does your organization actively manage risk to its reputation? And here you can choose all that apply. So about half of you have voted, so I'll leave it open a couple more seconds. All right, I'm going to close it and share it. And this one isn't going to be a clear one because you can vote for more than one. It looks like most people, 59% of you, have it as part of your crisis management planning part of your organization. And then next, it's part of your risk management, and it's part of top management. And then kind of evenly split, part of business continuity, it's the responsibility of legal. And then we have almost 25% that are not aware of any planning to protect your reputation. So this is where you really need to seek out, especially if you're in the business continuity space, making sure that when you're doing your risk assessments and your business impact analyses, and when you're looking at how you have developed your communications, that you have identified your risk to reputation as part of that. So let's look lastly at rebuilding a reputation. Can a stain on your reputation be dry cleaned? So every corporation or every organization is going to face a reputational crisis at some point. Like we said, over 50% of you already have. So whether it's a communication misstep or a social media fueled crisis or just something with your products, you don't want to be defined by this crisis, and you don't want to become the poster child for this. Like I was saying with Enron and Anderson, that's when you're calling poster child. That is a poster child. So one of the things, and we've talked about this all the way through, is that you need to get aligned with your stakeholder expectations. When the initial crisis subsides, it's time to begin the process of advancing the company's longer-term reputation. Your company's reputation, like we've said, is defined by the extent to which it meets your stakeholders' expectations. And a crisis usually signifies a misalignment between what's expected of you and what you're doing. So you need to understand the expectations of your stakeholders. And this is why in every management system standard, and I think there's 12 or 15 of them now, they talk about the very first thing is in clause 4, understanding the needs and expectation of your interested parties, because it matters, and you need to make sure there's alignment with that. Secondly, you need to begin from strength and not weakness. And research shows that coverage around a crisis or a negative event will not be considered a barrier to engagement, or should not be considered a barrier to engagement or communication. And sometimes going quiet often raises suspicions even further. So what they're suggesting is that this is an opportunity for you to talk about how the strengths of your organization and to be very transparent with communicating your organization's credible strengths, and then use that credible platform to talk about your strengths. But you also need to own your mistake. And I know lawyers are going to say you shouldn't say sorry, but you need to say sorry in some manner that doesn't put you legally at risk. You need to own your mistake. And if your company created it, it's even more important. And so if you didn't create it and it's happened to you, you need to own the fact that you weren't prepared. So don't preach ethics, but just be really clear about what the infraction was and what specific steps you're taking to remedy the situation, and make sure that you're acting in it with integrity. Here's where I talked about corporate social responsibility. And it's being more and more that companies are expected, remember we talked about your stakeholders' expectation, to give back to society, to be green, to do all of these different things. And so what we thought about as social responsibility in the past is changing, and that's a hugely growing part of the organization, a part of what society is expecting from us. So make sure that your company shares what they're doing in a positive manner, like we talked about strength being strong. Also, demonstrate that your company is aligned with the values of its employees. You need to value your employees. They're your most important advocate, and they can put an approachable human face on an otherwise distant corporate entity. So many companies bounce back because of the advocacy and success of its and support of its employees. So making sure that you treat your employees well is also really important. And lastly, we talked again, they keep bringing this up, so if you're not doing it, you need to do it, but conduct real-time monitoring of opinion sentiment in social media to find out, are our messages working, and are we making progress? So as we get ready to close for the webinar today, just to summarize, an organization needs to understand how it is viewed by the public, what is its reputation, and in order to protect its reputation, an organization must continually work to strengthen its reputation as well as its brand entity. All organizations shall monitor social media to determine any risk to its reputation. And if your organization's reputation has been damaged by something that it's done, then it's imperative that you act quickly to remedy the situation. There are a ton of references, and just a reminder that this presentation and the recording will be available on our webinars page probably by Friday. We usually get it up that same week, and you'll have access to each of these references where you can do more of a deep dive into learning more about what was each one of those examples. And we're just really excited, as in our closing, that we are now launching our Crisis Management Communication Professional course as an instructor-led course. It's been an e-learning course for years, but people keep asking us for instructor-led, so it ran for the first time in September, and we are running it in the US and Canada February, May, and August, and there'll probably be one more in the fourth quarter. And if you look on our website in the upcoming weeks, you will see the addition of our ICOR partner schedules as well. We have also launched our 2019 webinar schedule, so go ahead and take a look at that. You can go to our webinar page and sign up for any of those. And we still have to work out our November and December schedule, but we've got the first 10 months already set. So please, when I close the webinar, you'll have the opportunity to give an evaluation. We do look at your evaluations. We care about your evaluations, and we use those to help plan for our speakers as well as different topics. If you have an idea of what you would like to have spoken or, as a webinar topic, please feel free to share that. Send an email to myself or just on the ICOR website. You can post any sort of question that you'd like. Thank you for attending, and enjoy the rest of your week.